1914. The British Empire stands as the undisputed financial center of the world. 45 million people live on the British Isles. London functions as the globe's banker. The pound sterling serves as the international reserve currency. Britain exports capital equivalent to 5% of its entire economic output annually. The Bank of England holds modest gold reserves but commands unparalleled financial credibility. And within 4 years, the government will owe £7.7 billion, equivalent to 127% of the nation's economic output. Interest payments alone will consume 44% of all government spending. 886,000 British soldiers will lie dead. And the empire that financed the world will spend the next century begging for loans from the country it once dismissed as financially unsophisticated. This isn't historical accident. This isn't bad luck. This is what happens when a government mistakes financial dominance for financial invincibility. When a nation confuses its role as global creditor with unlimited capacity to borrow. When an empire built on lending discovers, too late, that debtors do not win world wars, creditors do. I'm not here to moralize about sacrifice. I'm here to examine how an empire that ruled 1/4 of the Earth's surface, that exported more than any other nation, that literally invented modern finance, managed to bankrupt itself not once, but twice through a single catastrophic conflict. This is the story of how the First World War didn't just defeat Britain financially, it destroyed it permanently. The empire that controlled the world's money. 1870 to 1914. Britain doesn't just participate in the global economy, it is the global economy. The pound sterling functions as what economists call the pre-1914 International Monetary Fund. When countries face balance of payments difficulties, they borrow from London. When nations need to settle international debts, they use sterling. When businesses require capital for development, they turn to British investors. The numbers tell the story. British overseas investments average 5% of national economic output annually. From 1871 to 1914, Britain earns net revenues of 8.3% of economic output from its external position. That's not profit from selling goods, that's income from owning the world. British banks don't just lend money, they provide the infrastructure for global commerce. Sterling clearing services allow any member of the international system to settle debts without physically shipping gold. Nations hold their monetary reserves in pounds and earn interest on them. British financial management facilitates trade across continents. It all looks unshakable. It's built on assumptions that are about to collapse. The British defense budget in 1912 to 13 stands at £72.5 million, 3.1% of economic output. That's roughly the same proportion it's been since the end of the Second Boer War in 1902. Only 2% of the population pays income tax. The rate maxes out at 6%. The government runs balanced budgets. National debt hovers around £650 million, roughly 25% of economic output. But here's what nobody's calculating. Britain's gold reserves are dangerously small. The Bank of England has resisted calls to increase holdings because doing so would be impossibly expensive. The debate rages through government and city circles. What happens if a major catastrophe strikes? The conclusion? Nothing can be done. Britain's financial system depends on confidence, not gold. It's a bet that confidence will never break. That bet is about to fail spectacularly. The financial infrastructure that collapsed overnight. Late July 1914. European tensions explode. Foreign exchange markets break down. Money markets freeze. The Bank of England raises interest rates from 3% to 8%. On Friday, July 31st, the London Stock Exchange closes for the first time in its 117-year history. It won't reopen for 5 months. The British government suddenly needs to increase military spending at the exact moment its financial infrastructure implodes. Defense spending jumps from £72.5 million in fiscal year 1912 to 13 to £437.5 million. In 1914 to 15-14.9% of economic output. By 1915 to 16, it hits £1.4 billion, 40.8% of economic output. It stays there until the war ends. Think about what that means. In 1 year, defense spending increases 6-fold. In 2 years, it increases 20-fold. Every single aspect of government finance taxation, borrowing, monetary policy must transform simultaneously. And Britain has no plan for any of it. The government tries raising taxes. Income tax rates soar from 6% pre-war to 30% by 1918. The number of people paying income tax explodes. But even this dramatic increase covers only 40% of war expenditure. The other 60%? Britain has to borrow it. From 1914 to 1919, Britain runs a cumulative gross primary deficit of 148% of economic output. Let that number sink in. 148%. In 5 years, the government spends beyond what it collects in taxes, more than the entire nation's annual economic output. Modern economists studying fiscal space dash the capacity for governments to increase spending while maintaining market access. Dash calculate that in 2014, 11 developed countries lacked sufficient fiscal space to run deficits of this magnitude. Britain, in 1914, has even less capacity. It does it anyway. The borrowing spree that couldn't be sustained. November 1914. The government launches its first wartime bond offering. They call it the War Loan. The Chancellor appeals to patriotic duty. They also offer an attractive yield, 4.1%, well above the 2.5% payable on other government debt at the time. Unlike existing government debt in the form of perpetual bonds, this loan promises to repay principal after 10 years. The banks agree to purchase £60 million. The Bank of England commits £39.4 million. The government needs desperately to raise money from ordinary citizens. The campaign succeeds, sort of. Britain raises money, but the amounts are never enough. A second war loan comes in 1915. A third follows in 1917. National war bonds launch in 1916, raising £678 million. A second series in April 1918 raises £483 million. A third in October 1918 raises £494 million. A fourth in February 1919 brings in only £76 million. The well is running dry. Total amount raised through national war bonds across all issues, £1.7 billion. In today's money, that equals roughly £105 billion. All of it promising 5% interest payments. Forever, because the government can't afford to repay principal. Here's what makes this catastrophic. Britain isn't just borrowing to fund its own war. By 1916, Britain is financing most of the empire's war expenditures, all of Italy's costs, and 2/3 of France's and Russia's expenses, plus smaller nations. Britain has transformed from global creditor to global debtor while simultaneously lending to everyone else. It's an impossible position. The gold reserves run out. The overseas investments get sold off. Private credit dries up. By 1917, Britain has no choice. It goes to the United States Treasury and borrows $4 billion. The empire that financed the world is now begging for American loans. The human cost nobody could afford. The war costs money. It also costs lives. 886,000 British military personnel die. Roughly 885,000 soldiers, plus casualties from the Royal Navy, Merchant Marine, Royal Flying Corps, and Royal Air Force. If you include civilian deaths from bombing raids, starvation, and disease, the total reaches approximately 994,000 deaths. 1.7 million soldiers are wounded, many wounded multiple times. Industrial production declines by 30%. Automobile production falls 60%. Consumer consumption drops 18% from 1914 to 1919. Trade union membership grows from 4.1 million in 1914 to 6.5 million in 1918. Between 1914 and 1918, Britain experiences 1,945 industrial disputes. Workers lose 8.5 million working days. Wages rise 8 to 12%. Inflation rises faster. Real incomes fall. Discontent explodes. Women enter the workforce in unprecedented numbers. The male-dominated world of banking collapses. By 1918, women staff positions that would have been unthinkable in 1914. Not because anyone wants social progress, because there's nobody else left to do the work. By November 1918, when the armistice finally comes, Britain has mobilized millions of men. Most never see combat. They simply sit in training camps, consuming resources the nation doesn't have. The recession. Nobody expected. 1919 to 20. The war ends. Victory parades march through London. The government expects rapid demobilization and economic recovery. That's not what happens. The economy experiences a brief post-Ash war boom. Private capital, pent up over 4 years of conflict, floods into the economy. Firms use wartime profits to acquire competitors in what critics call an orgy of speculation. Demand rises to unsustainable heights. Financial bubble inflates. Interest rates surge. The speculative bubble bursts. Autumn 1920. Britain enters the deepest recession in its history. Real economic output falls 23% between the third quarter of 1920 and the second quarter of 1921. Output does not regain its 1920 level until the spring of 1924, 4 years later. The unemployment numbers shock the nation. Unemployment jumps from 5.2% to over 10%. It stays above 10% for the entire decade. By some measurements, unemployment reaches 11.7%. Servicemen return from the Western Front to find no jobs waiting. The unemployment problem is particularly crushing for the thousands of veterans who fought for king and country and now can't feed their families. Why does this happen? The government pursues two contradictory goals simultaneously. First, they want to repay war debts and restore Britain's pre-war financial credibility. Second, they want to return the pound sterling to the gold standard at its pre-war exchange rate of $4.86 per pound. This requires deflationary fiscal and monetary policy. Government spending falls 25% over 1919 to 20. Real interest rates remain painfully high throughout the 1920s. The pound becomes overvalued by roughly 10 to 14%. British exports become uncompetitive. Industrial production stagnates. Economic growth flatlines. Compare 1920s Britain to other major economies. British economic output grows slower than predicted given the wartime decline. A statistical analysis shows that British economic output rose 22 percentage points, less than expected for a country with Britain's wartime losses. Britain is an outlier. Not in a good way. The 1920 to 21 recession is worse in Britain than anywhere else. Nothing comparable occurs in the 1930s or after World War II. It's a special event. The war economy rapidly runs down. Demobilized men can't find work. Female labor force participation falls. Total final expenditure falls 7% in 1921. Consumer spending collapses. Net exports crater. The speculative bubble bursts. World demand falls. Throughout the 1920s, Britain runs primary budget surpluses. Tax revenue exceeds government spending, excluding interest payments. The Chancellor implements the famous Geddes Acts in 1921 to 22 massive spending cuts to balance the budget. Years of austerity follow. The result? National debt. As a percentage of economic output, barely moves. By the mid-1920s, interest on government debt absorbs 44% of all government expenditure. 44%. That's more than the defense budget, more than education, more than infrastructure. Just interest payments on war debt. Britain runs fiscal surpluses during a deflationary recession with tight monetary policy and a fixed exchange rate. It's a masterclass in how not to reduce debt burdens. The austerity is counterproductive. The economy can't grow. Tax revenues don't increase. The debt burden persists. The return to gold that destroyed what remained. 1925. Winston Churchill, serving as Chancellor of the Exchequer, makes a fateful decision. He returns Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate of $4.86 per pound. The move is partly political. A strong pound represents British economic success. It signals financial credibility. It promises a return to pre-war normalcy. It's also economically catastrophic. The pound is overvalued. U.S. inflation has been very low. Britain effectively targets deflation to maintain the exchange rate. This requires keeping interest rates high to attract foreign capital. Real interest rates remain above 8% during a recession. With high unemployment and stagnant growth, British exports become even more uncompetitive. Industries like steel, coal, textiles, and shipbuilding suffer terribly. Regions dependent on these industries, South Wales, Northeast England, parts of Scotland, experience unemployment as high as 70%. The industrial areas that flourished during the Industrial Revolution now experience depression. John Maynard Keynes, the famous economist, is scathing in his criticism. He calls the gold standard already a barbarous relic. He's right. But Churchill and the Bank of England ignore him. They maintain the overvalued pound. They keep interest rates crippling high. The economy staggers through the 1920s. Then comes 1929. The U.S. stock market crashes. The Great Depression begins. Britain, already weakened, suffers more. British exports fall by half between 1929 and 1933. Industrial output falls by a third. Registered unemployment reaches 3.5 million in summer 1932. Many more have only part-time employment. September 1931. Britain finally abandons the gold standard. The pound immediately falls 25% against the dollar, from $4.86 to $3.40. British exports become competitive again. Interest rates can finally fall. Real interest rates drop from 9% in 1931 to 0.6% in 1933. The economy begins recovering. But the damage is done. Britain has wasted more than a decade pursuing policies that destroyed competitiveness, crushed industry, and impoverished millions, all to maintain an overvalued currency and service war debt. The permanent financial decline. The war debt never goes away. Some bonds get converted to lower interest rates in 1932. The government refinances repeatedly, but the debt persists. Britain pays roughly £5.5 billion in total interest on war loans from 1917 onward. £5.5 billion, just in interest. Some war loan bonds aren't fully repaid until 2015. That's 97 years after the war ended. Chancellor George Osborne finally redeems the last war bonds in March 2015. He announces proudly that Britain can, at last, pay off the debts Britain incurred to fight the First World War. Except that's not quite accurate. The government simply refinanced the debt into new bonds. The debt didn't go away, it just changed form. By the 1930s, Britain has lost its position as global financial center. The United States has become the world's principal economic power. The sterling area persists, but it's a shadow of the pre-Dash war system. British overseas investments are gone, sold to finance the war. Annual income from external investments vanishes. The empire that earned 8.3% of economic output from its global financial position now struggles to maintain trade surpluses. World War II makes everything worse. Britain borrows heavily again. By the end of that conflict, British debt exceeds 200% of economic output, just like after the Napoleonic Wars. Britain takes another massive loan from the United States in 1946, $586 million immediately, plus a $3.7 billion line of credit. Canada adds another $1.2 billion, all at 2% annual interest. The debt is to be paid off in 50 annual installments starting in 1950. Britain makes the final payment on December 31st, 2006. That's 61 years after the loan, 88 years after World War I ended. The long shadow of World War I debt complicated financial assistance before, during, and after World War II. Congress forbade Americans from purchasing bonds of governments in default. Senators denounced Britain as untrustworthy. Neutrality Acts constrained President Roosevelt's ability to help Britain prepare for and fight Germany. Even then, some First World War debt remains unpaid. In 1934, Britain still owed the United States $4.4 billion from World War I loans. During the Great Depression, Britain simply stopped making payments. The debt remains in what one scholar calls political limbo. Technically, Britain still owes it. Practically, it will never be repaid. The empire that never recovered, 1920 to 21. Britain suffers the deepest recession the country has ever experienced. Real GDP falls 23%. Economic output takes 4 years to recover. The decade that follows features deflation, depression, and mass unemployment. While the United States experiences the roaring 20s with strong growth and rising prosperity, Britain languishes in economic doldrums. Some observers argue that Britain didn't have a roaring 20s at all. It had a roaring 30s. After abandoning the gold standard in 1931, the British economy finally grows. Real GDP rises 26% between the third quarter of 1931 and fourth quarter of 1938. That's just over 7 years of strong growth, but it's too late. The damage from the 1920s is permanent. Britain has lost a decade. The United States has permanently displaced Britain as the world's financial superpower. The structural decline continues. British industries struggle to match productivity gains in the United States and Germany. The global financial system centered on London has been replaced by a system centered on New York and Washington. British income per capita, which was the world's third highest in 1914, falls further behind. By 1950, British output per head is still 30% above the average of the 6 founder members of what becomes the European Economic Community. Within 20 years, most Western European nations have overtaken Britain. The lessons are stark. Britain went to war as the world's banker. It emerged as the world's debtor. It spent 44% of government revenue on interest payments, while industrial regions suffered 70% unemployment. It pursued deflationary policies during a depression to service war debt and maintain an overvalued currency. It wasted the 1920s in economic stagnation. It took until 2015 to fully escape bonds issued in 1914. The First World War didn't just bankrupt Britain financially, it ended British economic hegemony permanently. France fought on its own soil and lost more soldiers. Germany lost the war entirely and paid massive reparations. But Britain won the war and lost the peace. It sacrificed its financial dominance to defeat Germany. It spent the next century paying the price. This is what victory looks like when you are the world's creditor and you fight a world war. You win the battle, you lose the system, and you never ever get it back.